It's a real pleasure for me to be able to address you at the Beijing Forum. This is a moment of multiple crises. Of course, there's the COVID-19, the pandemic, and then there's the climate change crisis. We are at the edge of a possible global debt crisis. We need global cooperation to solve all three of these crises and the multiple other challenges. But over the last few years, we've also had a crisis in global cooperation. The election of Joe Biden, I believe, is a turning point. The United States will rejoin the Paris Agreement. President-elect Biden has already made a commitment on that. I am hopeful that we will return to a rules-based international economic regime. The rule of law is just as important internationally as it is domestically. I also very strongly welcome his commitment to rejoin the World Health Organization. In a moment of pandemic, we need to cooperate globally to address this international health crisis. In a way, the scientists have shown the way. There's been unprecedented cooperation among the scientific community as they've sought vaccines, better therapeutics, better tests. They put aside many of the normal kinds of concerns about priority and who gets credit in the global effort to make sure that we have an effective vaccine, effective therapeutics, effective tests as quickly as possible. Internationally, Costa Rica has also led the way with its initiative at the World Health Organization of making sure that all of the intellectual property is put at the disposal of all the countries of the world, of all the peoples of the world. Intellectual property is obviously, ideas are obviously necessary in order to solve the pandemic. We've made enormous progress in being able to identify the disease and figure out ways of dealing with it through vaccines. And that would not have been possible without this global sharing of knowledge. Unfortunately, some countries and some companies have behaved in a way that we can only say is disappointing. Companies that put profits first. In some countries, there's been an exhibition of vaccine nativism. Public health is a public good. In fact, it's a global public good. And there has to be cooperation to make sure that the vaccines and therapeutics are made available to all the citizens of the world. And at the moments of scarcity, that it be allocated to the frontline workers, our health workers, who have done so much to protect the health of all of us. We won't be safe until all of us are safe. The pandemic won't be controlled until it's controlled everywhere. Now, the same is true for the global recovery. The economic consequences of the pandemic have been devastating. The pace of the economic decline has been unprecedented. While it is good news that there's been a bounce back, it is still the case that GDP and employment are markedly lower than they were a year ago. And developing countries and emerging markets don't have the resources that the developed countries have that have enabled them to manage the economic aftermath of the pandemic as well as they have. This is another area where global cooperation and the multilateral institutions have actually been working. The IMF has shown real leadership in terms of mobilizing resources for the developing countries and emerging markets. But while there have been moments in which you might say global cooperation has worked, in many ways, there have been big disappointments. The G20, for instance, said it would use all available instruments to fight the economic consequences, the aftermath of the pandemic. But it has failed to do that. Most notably, one of the important instruments with which the global community can respond, help the developing countries and emerging markets, are the special drawing rights, a kind of international money that actually was put into the charter of the IMF by Keynes, because he recognized in an economic downturn, the kind of stimulus that you can get from this kind of international cooperation could be vital. We used that, the international community used that, in 2008-9 in response to the global financial crisis. There was a vast expansion of SDRs. And I think it did help the global recovery. But unfortunately, in this particular instance, India, and most importantly, the United States, effectively vetoed this important initiative. As I said, the head of the IMF called for a $500 billion expansion of SDRs. That could be done without going back to the parliaments. All it needed was the support of the finance ministries. In the US, the case of the US Treasury. And for no good reason, no reason at all, they refused to support this important initiative. It was not even in the self-interest of the countries who took this peculiar position. $500 billion would have made a big difference for the global recovery. In fact, some countries around the world said, countries which didn't need to make use of the SDRs, whose economic resources are sufficiently great that they can address the post-pandemic downturn, said that they would donate or relend their SDRs to those countries, the emerging markets and developing countries, that needed it. This is a real demonstration of the kind of global cooperation that we should hope for. There is another impediment to a strong global recovery, the threat of a debt crisis. At the beginning of the crisis, there was a worry about liquidity. The fact was that it was thought that there would be a short interruption, a few weeks, a few months, and then the world would pick up. And in that short period of time, countries would need assistance. But now, as we move towards the end of the year, it is very clear that the economic interruption is not just a few weeks or a few months. The pandemic is going to be with us for months to come. And the economic consequences of that will be with us for months and perhaps years to come. A liquidity crisis has morphed into a solvency crisis. In the beginning, the G20 said that there should be a stay. That is to say that creditors should not demand payment of what is owed until the pandemic passes. It was focused on official creditors and the least developed countries. But far more than that is necessary. The private sector, multilateral institutions, all creditors have to be involved. And as time has evolved and the pandemic has stayed with us, it is clear that the liquidity crisis has, as I said, morphed into a solvency crisis. And what is going to be needed is not just a stay, but a debt restructuring. In the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, I was asked by the president of the General Assembly to assemble a group of experts to address the question of what reforms were necessary to the global economic architecture as we went forward. And one of our strong recommendations of our commission was the creation of some mechanism for solving cross-border bankruptcies, defaults, and in particular, addressing the problem of sovereign debt restructuring. I was pleased with the resonance that idea had. It was endorsed by the General Assembly in 2014, and then overwhelmingly in 2015, the General Assembly adopted a set of principles to guide the creation of such a sovereign debt restructuring framework. The problem was a very small number of countries opposed, but among those countries were the creditor countries. They thought somehow market mechanisms would suffice. I believe, and what has happened since then has shown, they were wrong. And so here we are in 2020, in the midst of a possible massive episode of countries not being able to repay their debts without an adequate framework. And one of the things that the global community needs to do now is to create such a framework. But unfortunately, that won't be done in time to help us in this debt crisis. So now we need to do something at this moment of an emergency. We need action. And that requires, again, global cooperation. The countries of the world have to recognize a basic principle, sometimes called the principle of necessity, the force majeure. In ordinary language, it's simply the idea that you can't squeeze water out of a stone. It's in no one's interest to have a global debt crisis. What we've seen so far is a disappointing cooperation from the private sector and even from some government-owned banks around the world. They've even refused to cooperate in a standstill, let alone what is really needed now, which is the debt restructuring. And that debt restructuring has to be deep. One of the lessons that we've learned from earlier debt crises is the problem of too little, too late. If there's not a deep enough debt restructuring, and if we wait too long, the consequences will be severe. The damage will be long-term. There will be a huge amount of economic suffering. And in this moment of the pandemic, countries won't even be able to take the health measures which they need. It's become clear that countries all over the world need large fiscal programs. One of the hallmarks of the 2008-9 crisis was the cooperation of the countries through the G20, led by Gordon Brown, in having a coordinated fiscal stimulus to the economy. Monetary policy then was not up to the task, and even more so now, with interest rates already near zero. There's little way that they can address the problems. And even more so as we recognize that it's not an issue, as I said before, of liquidity, it's a problem of solvency. And lending doesn't solve the problem of insolvency. It just makes people more in debt. In the beginning, as I said before, there was a problem with liquidity, but we've moved well beyond that. And that means the countries with fiscal space, the countries that have the ability to take actions to make sure that their economies recover, have to do so. They need to do their part in the global recovery. And of course, what we're talking about here is the United States, China, and Europe. But there's one aspect of this that needs to be emphasized, and that Keynes emphasized in the midst of the Great Depression. Trade surpluses, where countries produce more than they consume, are problematic. They've always been problematic, and they are especially problematic now. These trade surpluses are just another version of beggar thy neighbor policies, the policies that played out so badly in the Great Depression. Well-designed fiscal programs can help address the other challenges facing the world, and to which I referred at the beginning of my talk. The problem of climate change and the problem that I didn't talk about, which has absorbed much of my attention in recent years, and that is the problem of inequality. This pandemic has been particularly hard on the poor. The virus is not an equal opportunity virus. It's gone after people who have pre-existing health conditions, which disproportionately are people at the bottom. It's gone after people who are more exposed to others, disproportionately people at the bottom. And so the inequalities that were present before the pandemic have been exposed and have become exacerbated. And so economic policies have to respond to the climate crisis and the inequality crisis. And that's where the motto that, as many countries have emphasized, build back better, becomes so important. We need to reconstruct the post-pandemic economy in a way that is greener, more equal, more resilient, and more knowledge-based. Research has shown that we can design fiscal measures that are timely, targeted, and in accord with this broader vision. Some of the work that I've done with Cameron Hepburn at Oxford, with Nick Stern at LSE, and a team of researchers at Oxford, has shown very, very strongly that there doesn't have to be trade-offs, that one can design fiscal measures that help the economy recover and build a bridge to the kind of post-pandemic economy and society that we would like to have. The pandemic has been a period of extraordinary learning. We've learned a lot about the disease. We've learned a lot about our societies, about our economy. In some ways, it's been a natural experiment. In the social sciences, you can't do normally real experiments, at least at the societal level. Some countries have done much better than others, both in controlling the pandemic and in controlling the damage, the economic damage that the pandemic has brought about. Different countries have tried different policies, and there will be a wealth of data that economists and social scientists can use in coming years to try to understand what contributed to the successes and what contributes to failures. Already, though, we've gotten lots of ideas and learned a great deal. As I look at what we've learned in the last few months, many of the ideas about what makes for a good response to the pandemic are very similar to those ideas that make for what makes for a successful economy more generally. Over the last 250 years, standards of living have risen enormously. One of the questions which I asked in my book, People, Power, and Profits, is what is the real source of the wealth of nations? Why was it that we were able to increase standards of living so much over the last 200 years? And there are a few basic ideas. They may seem very simple, but we often forget them. The first is the importance of science. And the second is the importance of institutions of truth. And including among those institutions of truth are a free and active press, holding to account our political leaders and our corporate leaders as well. A third ingredient is the importance and respect for the institutions and respect of citizens for each other. The pandemic is an example of what economists call externalities. What one person does can either increase the likelihood of another person gets a disease or decrease that likelihood. And when citizens show respect for each other, they act in ways that reduce the risk of contagion. And finally, it's shown the importance of trust. The work that I've done at the OECD has shown that this element of trust is particularly important as an ingredient of successful economic performance, an ingredient which economists in the past have not talked enough about. New Zealand, a small country, has set an example for the whole world in each of the areas that I've just talked about. It's been able to essentially eradicate the disease. And as it has done that, it has actually strengthened the institutions, strengthened social solidarity, strengthened democracy, and shown that one can address the disease in ways that are consistent with important values within a society. These are among the lessons I think that we have learned from this crisis. And so too, we have learned the importance of global cooperation. I hope we take to heart these lessons in the years to come. Thank you for this opportunity to share my thoughts.